It all started on a quiet suburban street, where neatly trimmed lawns and perfectly painted houses made everything look peaceful. On the surface, the neighborhood seemed like an ideal place to live. But behind the curtains, whispers and suspicions had begun to spread. Something wasn't right. The HOA president, the man who was supposed to uphold rules, protect residents' rights, and maintain order, had started acting differently. There were rumors, little hints, odd comments, and strange activity. And then it became impossible to ignore. The first sign appeared when a couple of neighbors noticed unfamiliar trucks arriving early in the morning. Bulldozers, dump trucks, and heavy construction machinery were being parked on a lot that, according to public records, didn't belong to the HOA. In fact, it belonged to a quiet, elderly neighbor, Mr. Ahmed, who had lived on the same property for over 3 decades. He was known for his calm demeanor, never complained, and always waved politely to passers-by. But one morning, he noticed a crew unloading equipment directly onto his land. Initially, Mr. Ahmed assumed it was a mistake. He stepped outside, cane in hand, and approached the foreman. "Excuse me," he said politely, "this is my property, you shouldn't be here." The foreman, clearly uneasy, muttered something about a permit, a project, and the HOA's instructions, but Mr. Ahmed knew no one had asked for his approval. Word spread quickly. A few neighbors came to investigate. They saw bulldozers tearing into the earth, dumping soil, leveling the backyard, and beginning what appeared to be the foundation of a large house. Panic set in. Everyone knew the HOA president personally. He was Mr. Daniel Harper, a man with a charismatic smile but a reputation for strict control over the neighborhood. But nobody could imagine he would cross the line so blatantly. The community was stunned. Calls were made to the HOA office, but no one answered clearly. The office claimed that the president had obtained a special permit for development, though no records existed. Residents began to question whether the rules that applied to them, the same rules that prohibited simple backyard sheds or fences, were suddenly irrelevant when it came to the president himself. The sense of betrayal was deep and personal. By the third day, the house's frame was partially up. Heavy machinery roared through the quiet streets from dawn to dusk, shaking windows and rattling nerves. Children playing in yards stopped mid-game, staring at the enormous structure that seemed to grow overnight. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, discussing the situation, horrified at the audacity. One mother, holding her toddler, whispered, "He can't get away with this, can he?" Inside the house across the street, another neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, dialed the county building department. She described the situation, trying to stay calm, but the frustration and disbelief in her voice were palpable. The response was bureaucratic and slow. "We'll send someone to verify the permit," they said, "but that could take days, weeks even." And in the meantime, the president continued bulldozing and expanding, seemingly unstoppable. Mr. Ahmed, meanwhile, tried to remain composed, though his heart was pounding. He walked along the border of his property, observing the lines of construction. Each measurement seemed deliberate, precise, almost like an invasion mapped out down to the inch. It wasn't just carelessness, it was a strategic seizure. And as he stared at the construction crew, a chilling thought hit him. This wasn't just about building a house. It was about power, about showing everyone who truly controlled the neighborhood. Late in the evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the chaotic lot, Mr. Ahmed's neighbor, Mr. Patel, approached him with his phone out. "Look at this," he said, showing grainy footage from a hidden security camera. The video revealed something shocking. The HOA president himself, wearing a hard hat, inspecting the land, measuring distances, and giving instructions to the crew. There was no question, he was actively overseeing this illegal construction. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some neighbors speculated about bribery, others about forged documents. One thing was clear, the president had violated every principle he was supposed to uphold. And now the community's sense of trust was shattered. People who had once smiled at him at HOA meetings now whispered in fear, wondering if he could go even further. By the 5th day, things escalated. The president arranged for additional machinery, more bulldozers, cement mixers, and dump trucks. The lot expanded as if the construction crew had been given carte blanche. A few courageous neighbors tried confronting him directly, but he dismissed them with a polite, condescending tone. "All of this is legal," he said. "You'll see once the permits are finalized." But the permits never came. And as night fell, headlights from trucks lingered ominously on the property, casting long, dark shadows across the street. In the background, subtle signs of manipulation began to surface. The HOA newsletters, once mundane announcements of meetings and social events, now subtly hinted that the president's projects were beneficial to the community and pre-approved. Residents began questioning whether the organization itself had been complicit, silently condoning the illegal activity. Trust had been broken, and paranoia began to creep in. Neighbors began documenting everything: videos, photos, timestamps. Social media posts shared their concerns, but with each upload, the president seemed to tighten his control. Security guards appeared, ostensibly to monitor safety, but their presence felt more like intimidation. And all the while, bulldozers continued to tear into the earth, as if devouring the neighborhood's sense of justice piece by piece. As night fell on the 7th day, Mr. Ahmed sat on his porch, staring at the construction lights. The large structure loomed over his property, partially framed, already encroaching on his yard. A deep sense of violation settled in. This wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of greed, abuse of authority, and betrayal. And yet he knew something had to be done, something had to stop it. But how could one man challenge a president who controlled the HOA, influenced neighbors, and seemingly had every advantage? Suddenly a faint sound broke the quiet, the clatter of metal, a muted shout, then silence. Mr. Ahmed stood squinting into the darkness. Could it have been one of the construction workers questioning the legality, or someone else entirely? Whatever it was, it felt like the first crack in a facade that had seemed unbreakable. And as the camera of a neighbor silently recorded the scene from across the street, the tension only deepened. The story was no longer about land. It was about courage, exposure. And the ultimate question, would justice prevail, or would the president's audacity continue unchecked? The community had been shaken, the machinery continued to roar, and the lights on the lot glowed like an ominous warning. And in that moment, every neighbor knew that this was only the beginning. The following morning, the neighborhood woke to the deafening roar of engines. Bulldozers, dump trucks, and cement mixers were already at work before sunrise, their headlights cutting through the early fog. Mr. Ahmed's heart sank as he watched the machinery carve deeper into his land. Every inch of his property seemed to vanish beneath the president's ambition. What once had been a quiet, serene yard was now a war zone of steel and soil. Neighbors gathered again, whispering anxiously among themselves. Some shook their heads, others gritted their teeth in silent anger. Mrs. Lopez, clutching her phone, was already recording the chaos. "We have to do something," she murmured, "but what? Who's going to stop him?" Her words echoed the unspoken fear in every resident's heart. Inside the house of another neighbor, Mr. Patel called the county inspector directly. "This is urgent," he said. "The HOA president is building on someone else's land. Bulldozers, trucks, machinery, all happening right now. You need to come immediately." The line went silent for a moment, then a soft, bureaucratic reply. "We'll get there as soon as we can. Please document everything." Frustration mounted. The system moved slowly, but the president's construction continued without pause. Meanwhile, Mr. Ahmed decided he could no longer sit idle. He approached the site, his cane tapping heavily on the cracked pavement. The construction foreman hesitated as he saw Ahmed step closer. "Sir, this area has been approved," the foreman repeated nervously. "It's legal." But Ahmed's eyes met the foreman, piercing and unwavering. "You are on my property," he said firmly. "You don't have permission. Stop." The foreman swallowed hard and glanced toward the president, who was observing from a distance with a smug expression, clipboard in hand. The president, Daniel Harper, walked slowly toward Mr. Ahmed, his polished shoes crunching on the disturbed soil. He wore a hard hat and a confident smile, projecting calm authority. "Mr. Ahmed," he said smoothly, "everything here is perfectly legal. The HOA approved this project, and you will see once all permits are finalized. There's no need for concern." But there was concern. An entire neighborhood was watching. Children peeked through blinds, couples whispered on porches, and even distant neighbors pulled out cameras, capturing every angle. The president's attempt to assert dominance only deepened suspicion. His calm demeanor couldn't mask the audacity of his actions. As the machinery continued its relentless work, a plan began to form among the neighbors. If official channels moved too slowly, maybe they could act. Mr. Patel suggested, "We need undeniable evidence. Photographs, videos, measurements, something the authorities cannot ignore." Mrs. Lopez nodded, already reviewing footage she had captured overnight. Mr. Ahmed, though elderly, felt a surge of determination. He had lived in this neighborhood for decades, and he would not allow a single person, no matter how powerful, to trample his rights. That afternoon, the construction site erupted into chaos. One of the bulldozers accidentally shifted, crushing a stack of lumber meant for the house frame. The foreman cursed under his breath, and the president's expression tightened. It was the first visible crack in his carefully constructed confidence. He barked orders to the crew, gesturing wildly, but his authority began to waver under the intense scrutiny of the neighborhood. Neighbors, emboldened by the slip, began approaching more directly. Mr. Ahmed's voice carried across the lot. "You are destroying my property. Stop this immediately." The president, maintaining a veneer of control, waved them off. "I am authorized," he said. "Move along." But even as he spoke, a subtle tremor in his tone betrayed him. By evening, the tension reached a breaking point. Mrs. Lopez, who had been quietly filming everything, uploaded her footage to a private group chat among residents. The clips showed the bulldozers encroaching on Mr. Ahmed's yard, the president directing operations, and workers moving soil without consent. The evidence was undeniable, and fear began to shift into anger. Meanwhile, a storm began rolling in. Thick clouds gathered, lightning flashed, and the first drops of rain fell, mixing mud with the already churned earth. The construction site became slippery, dangerous. The president, seemingly undeterred, continued his oversight, but the elements added a new layer of suspense. Workers struggled to maintain balance and the machines groaned under the wet soil. It was as if nature itself was signaling disapproval. Inside his home, Mr. Ahmed reflected on the situation. His life had been one of quiet routines, peaceful afternoons, and small joys. Now bulldozers and trucks had intruded into his life, threatening not just his property but his sense of security. He realized that the president's actions were not just illegal, they were personal. Every swing of the excavator, every pile of dirt dumped onto his yard, felt like an affront to his dignity. Neighbors rallied around him, sharing stories of past HOA overreach, subtle manipulations, and instances where rules had been applied selectively. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated act of arrogance, it was part of a pattern. The president's authority had gone unchecked for years, and now it had reached a tipping point. As night fell, headlights from trucks cut through the darkness, illuminating the half-built structure. Mr. Ahmed and a small group of residents stood on the sidewalk, their faces tense but resolute. "We need to expose this," Mr. Patel whispered. "We have to make sure the authorities cannot ignore it." The storm's wind howled, whipping around their faces, and in that moment every neighbor felt the weight of responsibility. The president, inside the lot, appeared oblivious to the mounting defiance. He surveyed the construction progress with satisfaction, unaware that the community was documenting every move, every violation, and every misstep. The night's shadows made the machinery look larger, more threatening, and more symbolic of the president's audacity. And then in the quiet tension before midnight, a critical moment occurred. One of the workers, frustrated and frightened, whispered something about not wanting to continue. "This is illegal," he said. "I don't want to be part of this." His voice carried just far enough for Mr. Ahmed to hear. It was a small crack, but it felt monumental, a hint that even inside the president's circle, doubt had begun to creep in. The community held its breath. The president might have seemed unstoppable. But for the first time, vulnerability emerged in his carefully orchestrated plan. The machinery hummed, the storm raged, and the neighborhood stood united, ready to challenge the audacity of the man who had overstepped every boundary. And as the night deepened, the unfinished house loomed like a shadow over Mr. Ahmed's yard, symbolizing not just the physical encroachment, but the moral battle about to unfold, a battle that would test courage, expose secrets, and challenge the very authority that the HOA president had wielded for so long. The following morning promised confrontation, evidence, and revelations that could shake the entire neighborhood to its core. Every resident knew that the situation had reached a critical point. The question now was not whether the president would stop, but whether the community could finally make him accountable. The sun rose over the neighborhood with a pale, hesitant glow, casting long shadows across the half-built structure that now dominated Mr. Ahmed's yard. The storm from the previous night had left puddles of mud and debris scattered across the property, making it difficult for the bulldozers and trucks to operate. But Daniel Harper, the HOA president, seemed undeterred. Standing on the edge of the property, clipboard in hand, he gestured to the construction crew as if commanding an army. Neighbors began arriving early, some bringing cameras, some carrying notebooks, others simply standing in silent protest. It had become clear over the last few days that formal complaints and phone calls to the county were moving too slowly. The only way to challenge Harper was to gather irrefutable evidence, and to confront him directly, showing the world that his power was not absolute. Mrs. Lopez was among the first to step onto the muddy verge of Mr. Ahmed's land. Her phone was recording steadily, capturing the bulldozers inching closer to the property line. "This is our proof," she whispered to the others, "and we can't let him intimidate us into silence." Mr. Patel, standing beside her, nodded, his jaw tight with anger. "We've been patient," he said, "but patience isn't justice. Today we make him accountable." As the morning progressed, tensions escalated. One of Harper's crew attempted to move a bulldozer closer to the property line, ignoring the protesters. Mr. Ahmed, leaning on his cane, stepped forward and called out, "Stop! That's my land, you have no right here." The foreman hesitated, clearly unsure whether to obey Harper or comply with the elderly man's demand. Harper's voice rang out across the lot, firm but carrying an edge of irritation. "Everything is legal," he shouted. "You will see the permits, there is nothing you can do to stop progress." But his assurance rang hollow. Neighbors had already documented the previous day's events, capturing Harper personally directing machinery onto land that was not his. It wasn't just defiance, it was arrogance, and everyone could see it. A sudden commotion drew everyone's attention. One of the dump trucks had slipped in the mud, spilling its load of gravel and partially blocking the path of the bulldozer. The crew scrambled to regain control, but the moment created an unexpected opportunity for the neighbors. Mrs. Lopez and Mr. Patel moved closer, snapping pictures, measuring distances, and ensuring the construction's illegality was thoroughly documented. The HOA president, noticing their movement, stormed toward them. His polished shoes sank into the mud, leaving long streaks behind him. "Step back," he demanded, gesturing wildly. "You are trespassing on construction property." His anger was palpable, yet the closer he got, the more evident it became that his authority had limits. Mr. Ahmed stepped forward again, his voice unwavering despite his age. "This is my land, Daniel," he said calmly but firmly. "You have no right to be here, no one gave you permission." Harper's face darkened. There was a pause, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. The storm from the previous night had left the air electric, and every resident watching sensed that a confrontation was inevitable. While Harper was distracted, Mrs. Lopez's camera captured a detail that would later become pivotal. Hidden beneath a pile of gravel, partially covered by mud, was a set of documents, plans that purported to grant Harper permission to build. But upon closer inspection, it was clear that the permit had been falsified. The dates were inconsistent and signatures seemed forged. The proof was undeniable. The HOA president had deliberately manipulated documents to justify illegal construction. By midday, the tension had reached a fever pitch. Harper attempted to continue directing the crew, but several workers had begun hesitating. One of them, a young man named Lewis, approached Mr. Ahmed cautiously. "Sir," he said, "I don't want to be part of this. It feels wrong. I'm supposed to follow orders, but this is your property. You're right." His admission sent a ripple through the crowd. Even Harper's crew was beginning to fracture under the weight of the situation. The neighbors, sensing momentum, began to coordinate. They marked property lines, took GPS readings, and recorded the precise locations of machinery relative to the land. The photographs and video footage told a story far more damning than words could convey, a clear, systematic encroachment orchestrated by the HOA president himself. Harper, noticing the organized resistance, grew visibly agitated. "Enough," he shouted. "Move away from the equipment, I will call the authorities." But the irony was striking. For years, he had controlled the HOA, dictated rules, and influenced which complaints were considered legitimate. Now the residents had the upper hand, armed with documentation that could no longer be ignored. Mid the chaos, Mr. Patel pulled out his phone and made a call. "County Inspector," he said, his voice steady, "you need to come now. The HOA president is constructing on private property without proper permits. We have evidence, videos, and eyewitnesses. Please come immediately." There was silence on the line, then a promise to dispatch someone urgently. For the first time, the threat of official scrutiny became real. Meanwhile, inside his office, Harper attempted damage control. He called his lawyer, trying to devise a narrative that could save him, but even the lawyer's voice carried unease. "Daniel," the lawyer said cautiously, "it looks bad. The neighbors have footage, measurements, and eyewitnesses. You may have overstepped." Harper's confident demeanor faltered. For the first time, he realized that his position of authority could be challenged and potentially dismantled. Outside, the storm clouds from earlier in the week had returned. Rain began to fall again, mixing with mud, creating treacherous footing for the construction machinery. One of the bulldozers skidded dangerously close to the property line, nearly tipping over. Harper shouted at the crew, but panic had begun to ripple through them. Fear, combined with guilt, weakened their resolve. The physical instability mirrored the moral instability of the president's actions. Amid the unfolding chaos, Mrs. Lopez continued to film, narrating quietly into her phone. "Look at this," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "The president of our HOA, the man sworn to protect us, is building illegally on private property. Bulldozers, trucks, documents, all of it shows deliberate wrongdoing. And now the community is watching, recording, and standing up." Her footage captured not just the machinery and the construction, but the faces of the neighbors, angry, fearful, resolute. Mr. Ahmed, sensing the opportunity to act decisively, took another step forward. "Daniel," he called out, voice carrying across the lot, "this ends today. You either stop or the authorities see this mess for themselves." The president's eyes narrowed, scanning the crowd, weighing his options. Every muscle in his body seemed tense, but he couldn't ignore the sheer number of witnesses, nor the undeniable evidence accumulating around him. Then an unexpected twist unfolded. One of Harper's senior crew members, a man who had worked for him for years, stepped forward. "Sir," he said, addressing Harper, "I won't continue. I won't be responsible for destroying someone's property illegally. You can't force me." The declaration stunned everyone. For the first time, Harper's control was openly defied. Neighbors exchanged glances, a mix of relief and anticipation. The moral weight had shifted. Harper was no longer just a powerful figure. He was a man exposed, vulnerable, and faced with collective accountability. The construction, which had seemed unstoppable, now teetered on the edge of collapse, not just physically due to the weather, but morally and socially. As rain continued to pour, the crowd began forming an organized blockade around the property line. Cameras, measurements, and witness statements solidified their position. Harper's voice, once authoritative, became strained, even pleading. "This is legal, you don't understand." but understanding had nothing to do with it anymore. The evidence was clear, the community united, and the president's narrative was crumbling. By late afternoon, the county inspector arrived, slipping through the mud and storm, clipboard in hand. Neighbors immediately presented their documentation, videos, GPS measurements, and photographs. The inspector's expression grew serious as he surveyed the lot. Bulldozers sat precariously on muddy terrain, trucks were partially loaded, and the half-built house encroached visibly onto Mr. Ahmed's property. It was undeniable. The construction violated property laws, HOA regulations, and moral boundaries alike. Harper's face fell. For the first time, the facade of control he had maintained for years shattered in front of the residents, the workers, and now an impartial authority. Every lie, every falsified document, every attempt to intimidate or manipulate the neighborhood was exposed in a single, undeniable moment. The inspector began issuing citations on the spot, instructing workers to cease all construction immediately. Bulldozers powered down, trucks idled silently, and a tense hush settled over the lot. Neighbors, though wet and muddy, felt a surge of triumph. They had stood together, documented the truth, and forced accountability on a man who believed himself untouchable. As Harper argued with the inspector, trying to salvage his position, Mr. Ahmed stood quietly, observing. His yard, once a peaceful sanctuary, had been invaded, trampled, and disrespected. But now, justice had arrived, not swiftly but decisively. The president's power had limits, and today those limits had been made painfully clear. And yet, despite the momentary victory, an uneasy feeling lingered. Harper was not gone. Legal battles, personal grudges, and community tension were far from over. The machinery had stopped, but the emotional and social ramifications were only beginning to ripple outward. The question remained, how far would Harper go to reclaim control, and what hidden strategies might he attempt next? The neighborhood had taken the first step toward justice, but the story was far from complete. What began as a quiet encroachment had transformed into a dramatic confrontation of power, integrity, and moral reckoning. And as the rain fell steadily, washing mud and dust from the half-built house, neighbors knew one thing with certainty: they had faced audacity, deception, and arrogance and survived. But the storm, both literal and metaphorical, was far from over. The aftermath of that stormy confrontation lingered like a heavy cloud over the neighborhood. Bulldozers sat idle, dumped trucks were backed into driveways, and the half-built house stood like a scar across Mr. Ahmed's yard. For a moment, there was a fragile sense of relief among the residents. They had stopped the construction, documented every violation, and forced the HOA president to confront legal scrutiny. But the tension in the air was palpable. The battle was far from over. Daniel Harper, the man who had wielded authority over the community for years, was not the type to concede defeat quietly. From his luxury home at the edge of the development, Harper watched as county inspectors meticulously measured property lines, photographed encroachment, and spoke to neighbors. His polished demeanor had cracked over the last few days, replaced by irritation, frustration, and a hint of desperation. He knew that the evidence against him was overwhelming, yet the desire to maintain control, to dominate the neighborhood he had manipulated for years, burned within him. Meanwhile, Mr. Ahmed sat on his porch, the rain from the previous day leaving damp streaks across the patio. He had lived in the neighborhood for decades, witnessing countless HOA meetings, minor disputes, and occasional violations. But nothing had prepared him for the audacity of the president attempting to claim his land. Even now, as inspectors finalized citations, Ahmed's heart pounded with the realization that this was more than a property dispute. It was a test of courage, of the power of community, and of moral resilience. The morning sun broke through gray clouds, casting sharp light on the half-built house and the muddy tracks of the bulldozers. Residents gathered once again, this time with a renewed sense of determination. They had been through fear, frustration, and intimidation, but the events of the previous days had emboldened them. Cameras clicked, smartphones recorded, and neighbors whispered strategies for what they knew could be a prolonged legal battle. Harper, aware that his authority was eroding, began mobilizing legal tactics. He called a meeting with his attorney, packing the marble floors of his office. "This neighborhood cannot humiliate me," he said, voice tight with suppressed anger. "They cannot override my position. We need to assert control to claim that all permits are valid." His lawyer, a seasoned professional, listened carefully but could not hide the concern in his voice. "Daniel," he said cautiously, "the evidence is overwhelming. You may have forged documents, directed illegal construction, and violated zoning laws. Fighting this could escalate matters and attract public scrutiny. You need a strategy that acknowledges reality." Harper's eyes narrowed. "Reality?" he spat. "Reality is what I define." But even he could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the walls of control cracking for the first time. Back on the property, inspectors moved methodically. They measured the encroachment down to the inch, comparing it with public records and legal documents. Bulldozers were photographed, the foundations documented, and detailed notes compiled for court proceedings. The presence of neighbors and the constant recording of events created pressure Harper could not escape. Even the crew, once loyal to him, now stood awkwardly in the background, reluctant to continue under scrutiny. The first whispers of accountability had transformed into tangible, irrefutable action. Amid this chaos, a critical revelation emerged. One of the workers, Lewis, approached Mr. Ahmed with a sealed envelope he had taken from Harper's site office the night before. "Sir," he whispered, voice trembling, "I couldn't take it anymore. These papers, they show everything. Every forged permit, every instruction to ignore property lines, even plans for bribing officials if neighbors complained. You need to see this." Ahmed carefully opened the envelope. Inside were photocopies of documents, handwritten notes, and signed approvals, all clearly falsified. His heart sank with anger and vindication simultaneously. Harper's deceit was complete, leaving no room for doubt. Neighbors gathered around, eyes widening as Ahmed read excerpts aloud. The documents detailed how Harper had attempted to manipulate zoning boards, falsify property surveys, and even intimidate county officials with subtle threats of influence. This wasn't just a case of overstepping authority. It was a carefully orchestrated plan to seize property and cement control over the neighborhood. The scale of the betrayal shocked even the most skeptical residents. By afternoon, news of the documents reached the county office. Officials reviewed the evidence meticulously, cross-referencing signatures, comparing permit applications, and verifying records. Within hours, they issued a cease and desist order that formally prohibited any further construction on Ahmed's property. Bulldozers were powered down, trucks were ordered off the lot, and Harper received formal notification that legal proceedings were imminent. But the story didn't end there. Harper, refusing to accept defeat, quietly attempted to rally allies within the HOA. He called a meeting of board members, attempting to argue that his actions were sanctioned under emergency community development projects. The board members, many of whom had previously been loyal to him, now faced mounting evidence, recordings, and the unified opposition of the neighborhood. Their expressions shifted from hesitation to concern. Some quietly excused themselves from the meeting, unwilling to be implicated in the scandal. Others exchanged glances, realizing the president's credibility was irreparably damaged. Outside, the atmosphere in the neighborhood grew electric. Residents began organizing regular patrols, monitoring the property to ensure no further unauthorized construction occurred. Cameras were installed strategically, and informal neighborhood watches formed to document any suspicious activity. It was a moment of empowerment. The community had moved from fear to action, from helplessness to vigilance. Harper's aura of invincibility had been shattered, and the people he had sought to control now controlled the narrative. The legal battle commenced swiftly. Harper faced citations for illegal construction, falsification of documents, and property encroachment. County officials demanded testimony from workers, neighbors, and even board members. The media, alerted to the scandal, began covering the story, highlighting the audacity of the HOA president and the collective courage of the community. Video footage captured by Mrs. Lopez and others went viral, showing the scale of the attempted land grab, the machinery, and the president's direct involvement. As court dates approached, tensions ran high. Harper's legal team attempted to discredit witnesses, claim bureaucratic misunderstandings, and argue that permits were in process. But the evidence was overwhelming. Photographs, videos, GPS coordinates, and the envelope of internal documents left no room for doubt. The story of arrogance, deceit, and abuse of authority unfolded in public view, with neighbors watching each hearing live, anxiously awaiting justice. During one of the most tense hearings, Lewis testified, recounting his direct experiences on the construction site. "I was ordered to move machinery onto Mr. Ahmed's property," he said, voice steady but emotional. "I questioned it and Daniel Harper insisted it was legal. I realized it was not. I brought the documents to Mr. Ahmed because I could no longer be part of an illegal act." The courtroom murmured with shock. Harper sat rigid, hands clenched, the first public acknowledgement of his wrongdoing laid bare by someone he had considered loyal. Over the following weeks, additional evidence surfaced. Emails revealed attempts to intimidate residents, forged correspondence with county officials, and plans for financial manipulation tied to the construction. Social media posts chronicled the community's struggle, amplifying public awareness. The story of the HOA president illegally building on private land became a cautionary tale across the state, a reminder of the importance of vigilance, documentation, and collective action. In the neighborhood, life began to slowly return to fragile normalcy. Bulldozers and trucks were removed from the lot, the half-built house was cordoned off, and Mr. Ahmed's yard was carefully restored to prevent further encroachment. Residents helped clean debris, patched fences, and supported each other through the stress and uncertainty of the ordeal. Bonds between neighbors strengthened, forged in the fire of collective resistance and shared moral purpose. Harper, meanwhile, faced mounting legal consequences. Citations, fines, and public scrutiny created pressure that even his influence could not neutralize. The HOA board, shaken by the scandal, began restructuring its leadership, emphasizing transparency and accountability. Harper's once unassailable position crumbled, replaced by public scrutiny, legal accountability, and the knowledge that his actions had permanently damaged trust. Yet despite the victory, the emotional toll on Mr. Ahmed and the community was profound. Weeks of anxiety, confrontation, and fear had left marks that were not easily erased. But in the midst of recovery, a sense of justice prevailed. The president's audacity had been met with courage, and the neighborhood had taken back control. The machinery, once symbols of oppression, now stood silent, reminders of both what had been lost and what had been reclaimed. One evening, as the sun set behind the now empty lot, Mr. Ahmed stood on his porch, cane in hand, surveying the restored property line. Children played safely in yards that had once been threatened, neighbors shared quiet conversations about lessons learned, and a tentative peace settled over the street. The HOA president's reign of unchecked authority was over, replaced by community vigilance, documentation, and moral courage. Even so, vigilance remained necessary. Harper had shown the lengths to which one individual could go to manipulate systems, bend rules, and attempt to overpower an entire neighborhood. Residents knew that authority could be abused again, but they were ready. Cameras remained, neighborhood watches continued, and a collective commitment to transparency and accountability became part of their daily lives. The story of Daniel Harper's illegal construction attempt spread beyond the neighborhood, reaching media outlets and legal analysts. Experts cited it as a textbook example of power abuse within HOA structures and the importance of resident oversight. For Mr. Ahmed, the experience was bittersweet. He had defended his property and his dignity, but the process had exposed the fragility of community structures and the moral hazards of unchecked authority. Months later, the legal case concluded. Harper faced fines, mandatory restitution, and restrictions on future HOA leadership positions. The half-built house was dismantled, machinery sold off, and the lot restored to its rightful owner. Public records were corrected, permits clarified, and the neighborhood finally breathed a collective sigh of relief. Justice, painstakingly slow but decisive, had prevailed. In the final scene, Mr. Ahmed walked along the property line, observing the restored lawn, the absence of machinery, and the renewed sense of community. He paused, taking a deep breath of fresh air, and realized that the neighborhood had not just defended a piece of land. They had defended integrity, morality, and the principle that no one, no matter how powerful, is above accountability. And though the scars of the ordeal would remain, both physical and emotional, the story left an enduring lesson. Vigilance, courage, and collective action can overcome even the most audacious attempts at deception. The HOA president's downfall had become a symbol of moral reckoning, a reminder that justice may be delayed, but it is never denied when people stand together. As night fell over the quiet street, the lights from homes glowed warmly, reflecting the renewed sense of security and unity. Mr. Ahmed stood on his porch one last time, watching children play and neighbors converse, feeling the satisfaction of a long-fought battle. The bulldozers were gone, the trucks silenced, and the half-built house was no more. Yet somewhere deep in the shadows of the neighborhood, the memory of Harper's audacity lingered, a warning and a testament. The machinery that had once represented threat now symbolized resilience, courage, and the enduring power of a community that refused to be dominated. And in that knowledge, the neighborhood found peace, closure, and the quiet triumph of justice finally served.